He is referred to as God's voice, the man whose very presence elevates commonplace statements to the level of absolute truth. Morgan Freeman has been telling our stories, guiding our dreams, and embodying wisdom on screen for decades. However, there is a truth Hollywood never told you that is hidden behind that unwavering voice. A man who was cruelly rejected for 50 years before he was nominated for his first Oscar. Black children in segregated Mississippi were taught that their lives were less valuable, and those who survived lived in abject poverty. Who became famous while working as a janitor, a cab driver, and a fair dancer. And the cost of that glory turned out to be disastrous when success eventually came and the world found out his name. At age 71, he suffered a terrible accident that permanently damaged his left hand. He is plagued by chronic pain every single second of the day. Public charges that tarnished a reputation that had been developed over 8 decades. And a tragedy so horrific, 16 stab wounds, blood on the sidewalk, a granddaughter torn from life, that not even his renowned voice can tell it without shattering. How did the voice of a generation be defined by an unseen boy from the Deep South? Why did it take the world 50 years to realize what was always there? And what was the true price of celebrity that came too late to stop the tragedies from happening? Before we start, please leave a like in honor of a man who dedicated his entire life to the craft. If Morgan Freeman's work has ever touched you, inspired you, or just made you believe in the power of storytelling. On June 1, 1937, Morgan Freeman was born in Memphis, Tennessee. However, his story really starts in Mississippi's dusty backcountry and cotton fields. In the late 1930s, the Deep South was more than just segregated. It was a battleground. Jim Crow laws were enforced strictly. Black children were taught early on that their lives were not as valuable as others, were admitted through back doors, and drank from separate fountains. Morgan Porterfield Freeman, Sr., Morgan's father, was a barber who was fighting to make ends meet in a system that discouraged black aspirations. My Edna, his mother, took any job that would help put food on the table, working as a cleaner and teacher. However, 2 incomes were insufficient. Morgan's parents made the heartbreaking choice that many families had to make during the Great Depression when he was still a baby. He was sent away. He was mostly brought up by his paternal grandmother in Charleston, Mississippi, a small town where poverty wasn't merely a state. Everyone breathed it. There were no running water, electricity, or other conveniences in his grandmother's home. "We were so poor, we didn't even know we were poor," Morgan would recollect years later, with frankness. Everybody around us led a similar life. Growing up in Charleston meant earning pennies a day by picking cotton under a harsh sun. It required dressing in garments sewn from flour sacks. Black children had to walk miles to dilapidated one-room buildings with out-of-date textbooks and overworked teachers, while white children took buses to well-funded schools. It was in those classrooms that Morgan learned to read. However, he also discovered something sinister. That before he ever had a chance to prove his value, the world had already determined it. Racism wasn't a concept. The shopkeeper was the one who avoided making eye contact with him. He was stopped by the policeman for crossing the street in the wrong direction. The oppressive knowledge that violence could result from one incorrect word or action. Morgan later acknowledged, "You learn to keep your head down. Being invisible teaches you how to survive." However, something was stirring even in that invisibility. Morgan almost accidentally discovered acting when he was 9 years old. He was chosen to play the lead in a school play. And something clicked as soon as he stepped onto that makeshift stage. He was not invisible for the first time in his young life. He wasn't impoverished. He wasn't just another black kid that nobody cared about. They saw him. They listened to him. He was also strong. There wasn't much applause. Only parents and teachers in the audience. For Morgan, however, it was enlightening. Decades later he would say, "That day, I fell in love with acting. I felt important for the first time, not because of the attention." Dreams, however, do not satisfy hunger. In pursuit of employment, his family relocated frequently, from Mississippi to Chicago to Indiana and back. They could not afford the luxury of stability. Morgan, who was always the new kid and the outsider, went to several schools. He joined the drama club at Broad Street High School in Greenwood, Mississippi, and threw himself into every role he could. Morgan studied characters, memorized lines, and dreamed of a world beyond segregation and cotton fields, while other boys played football or worked after school. His instructors took notice. He was told something that changed everything by one person in particular, a drama instructor whose name Morgan would carry with gratitude for the rest of his life. "You possess a gift. Don't waste it." He had never been told he was capable of anything more than survival before. However, presents don't cover expenses. Hollywood seemed as far away as the moon when Morgan graduated from high school in 1955. In the 1950s, black actors were reduced to stereotypes, slaves, and servants. Sidney Poitier was just starting to pry the door open. Being an actor seemed ridiculous to a Mississippi kid with no money, no connections, and no obvious career path. Morgan followed in the footsteps of millions of young men during that time. He enlisted in the U.S. Air Force out of necessity rather than patriotism. It was a salary. It was a flight of fancy. And it was a first step toward something better, he hoped. He served his country, trained as a radar technician, and detested every moment of it. "I believed that the Air Force would provide me with discipline and guidance." He later admitted it. "It taught me what I didn't want to be instead." Living inside someone else's structure and obeying orders suffocated him, he realized with painful clarity. The only thing that had ever felt like freedom was acting. And he would never pursue it if he didn't do so now. With just a duffel bag, a few bucks, and a dream that everyone told him was unattainable, 22-year-old Morgan Freeman left the Air Force in 1959 and relocated to Los Angeles. He had made it through Mississippi. He was a military survivor. The most difficult struggle of all was to survive Hollywood. It should have been a dream to live in Los Angeles in 1959. A breeze from the ocean, palm trees, and the golden promise of Hollywood beyond the horizon. However, L.A. was a chilly awakening for Morgan Freeman, a 22-year-old black man with a southern accent and no connections. No results came from audits. After glancing at him, casting directors gave him the same stale parts. Criminal, janitor, and bellhop. Portions that only needed a face to fill the background and didn't need a name. The rejection wore him down after less than 2 years. Perhaps the stage would have him if Hollywood didn't. Morgan moved to New York City in 1960 after packing his life into a single suitcase in an attempt to pursue the theater, which was the only area where black actors had any chance at success. In a different sense, New York was brutal. His savings were devoured by rent. The auditions were brutal. There are hundreds of actors vying for one part. And once more, the parts that were at his disposal were degrading. Slaves, servants, and unnamed extras. "I was invisible on stage for years, just like I was back in Mississippi," Morgan later acknowledged. "It was made worse by the fact that I was now intentionally invisible." He took any job he could find in order to make ends meet. He performed in the World's Fair Chorus in 1964. He answered phones and filed documents while working as a transcript clerk at Los Angeles City College. He picked up fares while mentally practicing monologues in traffic as he navigated the congested streets of Manhattan in a taxi. Rent, food, and the dim hope that the next audition would be different were all covered by every dollar. The subsequent audition, however, was always the same. Years went by. Morgan's ages were 25, 28, and 30. Acting class friends quit and went home. Others gave up on the dream after landing steady jobs. Despite the crushing weight of failure, Morgan persisted. In 1967, he wed Jeanette Adair Bradshaw. Together, they brought up 4 kids, 3 other kids and his stepdaughter from Jeanette's previous relationship. Acting wasn't just a dream anymore. It was careless. He had bills piling up and mouths to feed. And a profession that only existed in his mind. His face was familiar to the theater community. His work was respected by directors, but respect isn't enough to cover rent. He alternated between small experimental shows that paid virtually nothing, regional theater, and off-Broadway productions. His big break came in 1967 when Pearl Bailey starred in an all-black Broadway production of Hello, Dolly. It was Broadway, but it wasn't a lead. It was real. It demonstrated his ability to live in this world. Morgan honed his craft in front of live audiences who hardly noticed him as he performed night after night for years. He was learning, though. He learned timing, presence, and the power of stillness from Pearl Bailey's command of the stage. Morgan remembered that she could be heard without shouting. "I discovered then that the quietest voice can sometimes be the loudest." Nevertheless, After 15 years of hardship, Morgan was approaching 35 and had little to show for it when the 1970s arrived. He had a tense marriage. He was unable to give his kids the stability they needed. He was still viewed as expendable by the industry. When he tried out for movie parts, he was told that his face was too intense. His presence was too solemn, his voice too deep. Instead of black Shakespearean actors, Hollywood wanted black comedians. Depression began to set in. On some nights, Morgan would sit in his small apartment and wonder if he had made a grave error and if he ought to have remained in the Air Force, accepted a steady job, and led a typical life. "I doubted everything," he later admitted. "I wondered if I was pursuing something that wasn't meant for me." The Electric Company, a children's educational program on the public broadcasting service, then provided a lifeline in 1971. It was not a distinguished position. It was consistent labor, a salary, and widespread publicity, but it wasn't cinema. Morgan portrayed the hip character Easy Reader, who helped kids find the joys of reading. He was a frustrated Shakespearean actor who was barely making ends meet for 5 years. He performed and gradually gained a following of young people who had no idea who their favorite TV character was. Even that, though, seemed like a trap. He was 40 years old, adored by kindergartners, and unnoticed by Hollywood. The dream he had been pursuing since he was 9 years old seemed more distant than ever. Morgan was aware that time was running out because the lost decade had turned into 2 lost decades. Morgan Freeman had come to terms with an unpleasant reality by the early 1980s. He would never make it to the big screen. At 45, he was too proud to continue playing stereotypes, too old for major roles, and too unknown for leading roles. He wouldn't give up, though. He would prove himself on stage so that Hollywood couldn't ignore him if it didn't come to him. He began